spiritual house cleaning. That's part of what Passover is all about. Passover is so multifaceted. It has so many lessons for us. We can only really, cover a little bit at a time. And so we're going to be focused on spiritual house cleaning. And we'll focus on these two passages here, one from 1 Corinthians and the other from Exodus. So let's read these. This first one here. In fact, if you'd like to read along, let's read this together from 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6. Together. Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough? Clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump, just as you are, in fact, unleavened. For Messiah, our Passover, also has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the feast not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. And then from Exodus 12:15, together. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the seventh day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. In the context there of 1 Corinthians, Paul was dealing with some problems, not just in the individual's life, but in the community's life, because the community wasn't dealing with some sin that was occurring in the congregation that had the potential for spreading throughout the congregation. And it just kind of goes back to the idea, that we might have even said this ourselves. Well, what I'm doing, it's not hurting anybody, right? Anybody ever said that? Yeah? Anybody ever thought that? It's not really hurting anybody. It always hurts somebody. Somehow, it always hurts somebody. Even if it's just because you are not the person that you really should be. You miss out on a lot of opportunities to minister to other people. So here we have it, though. In these two passages, Paul is really kind of remezing back to this passage in Exodus, and he's applying it in a spiritual sense. In Exodus, it's literally telling us, we have to remove the leaven from our homes, and we can't eat anything leavened for 7 days. So those two passages go together, and really, how can we apply that to our lives? How do we really clean house in our own lives? That's the focus this morning. I can say that with 1 minute left, according to that clock anyway. Boker Tov, by the way. I can't say that in another minute. So here in this slide, the passage in Exodus, when we see, you can see the words unleavened bread, remove leaven, leavened bread. Those actually have different words in Hebrew and a little bit different meanings in them. And then the Greek there. It's interesting in the Greek, the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew there, it only uses one word for leaven, but there's actually two in Hebrew, seor and what's the more common one? Chametz, right? Most people know the term chametz for leaven. But seor it's related. Seor is chametz, but chametz is not always seor. So we'll get to that in a little bit. But these passages, they raise a lot of questions for us, and that's a good thing, because Passover and the Passover Seder, it's designed to draw from us questions. We're to ask questions, many questions during Passover, because that's how we learn. So spiritual house cleaning, this is literal house cleaning here, and preparation for the Passover. You can see in the top left one, there's a lot of house cleaning that goes on. Anybody been doing a lot of house cleaning for the last couple of weeks? You get into the cupboards. It takes a few weeks, really, usually in most houses, to get all the leaven out of the house, because you have to go into the cupboards. You have to, go every little corner you know, especially in the kitchen area and the dining room area. You have to get to every corner, and you have to, even, you know, if you bring food into your bedroom, you know, you gotta get under the mattress even sometimes and make sure that you get all, I mean, and the car. How many of you eat in the car? You know, you go in there and you vacuum things out, and there's a lot of cleaning going on. And there's a lot of preparation as well, especially for the Seder itself. There's a lot of shopping and just making sure that you have everything that you need for the Seder. So a lot of preparation goes into this. It's a time for questions, and so I put together 10 questions for Passover that we're going to look at this afternoon. It's not morning anymore. So, questions. So I wanted to share a story here. This is about a Jewish man. He was British, and he was going to be knighted, and he was knighted by the Queen of England. And so the tradition was that as you approached the Queen, you would have to address her in Latin. And then, you know, she would extend the sword, she would tap him on both shoulders, and he was knighted. The only problem was he knew no Latin at all. And so, you know, he was concerned about this, but a friend of his, you know, assured him it's not really a problem. You know, the Queen really doesn't know Latin that well, and any Latin you need to know, you can memorize it really easy. So that's what he did. He memorized what he needed to know when he was approaching the Queen. And so the day comes, and it's his turn to approach the Queen. He kneels down before her, and he draws a blank. An absolute blank. He just cannot think of anything. No Latin is coming to his mind at all. So he's a little panicked, but he's you know, he keeps his focus, and so he's going, well, maybe, you know, since she doesn't know Latin that well, maybe, you know, something in Hebrew, you know, and she won't know the difference, you know. So she's, you know, he's going through this, and so he has a song that comes to mind, you know, da 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 mikol halelot, and he's okay, you know, and so he blurts out, manish tanah Laila hazeh mikol halelot. And the Queen was stunned. You know, didn't sound like Latin to her. She turns to one of her advisors, and she says, "Why is this night different from all other nights?" Yeah, some people are just getting it. Yeah, now I got it. And if you didn't get it at all, after the Passover Seder, I think you'll understand, okay? Yeah. So, Isidore Rabi, this is actually a true story, okay? This is a true story. He was actually a winner of a Nobel Prize for physics, and he was asked one time, you know, how did you become a scientist, or why did you become a scientist? And he replied, my mother, you know, she made me a scientist without even knowing it. Because whenever I would come home from school, you know, all of the other kids, you know, what would their parents ask them? You know, as a parent, what would you ask your children? How was school today, and what did you learn, right? Well, his mother didn't do that. She said, did you ask a good question? And he said, that's what made me a scientist. You know, because that's how we learn. You know, to learn to formulate good questions. You know, we're always told, you know, there's never a bad question, right? Well, that may be true, but there's some questions that are better than others. And there's some questions that help us to learn better than others. So, but that's something that you learn over time, and you can learn from when you're a small child. I mean, how many of you as parents, you know, as when your child gets to be 2.5, 3, 4 years old, they become verbal, and what do? They bombard you with questions constantly. You know, and it's kind of funny because, you know, my wife, you know, she was with the kids all day. And so, you know, she would get this all day, and I would come home, and I'd love it. You know, they're asking questions, and they would still ask her questions, and she's getting tired of the questions. And I said, what are you doing? You're stifling them. You know, that's how they learn. And she's going, you're not here with them all day, you know. So, but that is how they learn, you know, and we want to encourage that. And of course, yes, you know, a parent gets tired, and so you hand them off to the other parent, right? That's how it works. So let's get to our 10 questions here for Passover. First of all, how do we prepare for the Passover? We're not going to cover that in depth, but we'll look at that a little bit. What does leaven mean in Hebrew? And you might be surprised because it doesn't mean exactly the same thing as it does in English. And yet most of us learn from English translations. Too fast. Number 3, by when does all leaven need to be removed from our homes? Number 4, do we really celebrate Passover? Do we really celebrate Passover, as some translations suggest? And you might be surprised by the answer. Number 5, what is the difference between observing Passover and doing it? Number 6, what is the difference between the Karate Kid method of observing Passover and the Jewish interrogatory method? I know there's some lawyers in the room. I'm not using that in the legal sense, but we'll get to that. Number 7, what is the best time to ask questions in the Seder? Number 8, what is the spiritual meaning behind removing the leaven from our homes? And what does Paul mean by saying, you are matzah? How many of you have read that in Paul's writings, you are matzah? Actually, probably most of you have read that from Paul. You just didn't realize it. So we'll look at that in a little bit. And then, how does the Seder end? And we'll finish with that. So, this is question number 1. How do we prepare for the Passover? First of all, in temple times, Passover was one of the 3 shalosh regalim, right? The 3 pilgrimage feasts. And so, where do we go to celebrate Passover? Jerusalem. Yep, that's the ideal. It's a little hard from California, but, and we don't have the temple standing either. So there's some things that we just can't do for Passover. But during the temple times, when the temple was standing, there was also the preparation for the Pesach. And Pesach, by the way, is the Hebrew term for Passover. That literally means, it literally refers to the Passover sacrifice, the lamb that was sacrificed. Not just one lamb, because there were actually tens of thousands of lambs, if not even hundreds of thousands of lambs when the population was really built up. There were a lot of lambs sacrificed at the temple there. But the preparation was that households, as they came to Jerusalem and wherever they were staying when they were in Jerusalem, on the 10th of Nisan, on the 10th of the month, they were to have a lamb. They were to set aside a lamb, or even to bring it into their dwelling place or near their dwelling place. It almost became like a pet. That's why I put that picture up there, because it's very cute, right? And you might even get a little attached to that lamb. But then on the 14th of the month, and it says Bein Ha'arbaim, which is between the evenings, and really the intention was that in the afternoon, or even late in the afternoon, that the Passover lamb was to be sacrificed on the 14th. Then it was taken back to the dwelling place. If you lived in Jerusalem, back to your home, or whoever you were staying with, you would take it back. Take the meat back. Sometimes it wasn't a whole lamb that you would take back from the temple, but you would take it back and you would boil it. No, you would roast it. Very specific, and there's a reason for that, but you would roast it. And then, just a few hours later, the Passover Seder begins, and that's actually on the first night of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is when the Passover Seder would be held, and that's on the 15th of the month. So there's a preparation there, and it all has a lot of meaning there. But that was part of the preparation during the times of the temple. So today, now that we don't have the temple, we still have a lot of preparation. In fact, you look at the bullet items, it seems like we have more preparation. Cleaning, of course, removing all the chametz. That's a very big chore. And you see the picture there. That's a picture from my home. That box is just one of several where we would empty out the cupboards, a few weeks in advance. We would empty out the cupboards of anything that had leaven in them, chametz, and we would put it in the box so that everybody knows that we got to focus on that. We got to eat that before the Passover comes, or we just have to get rid of it. We have to give it away or whatever. Some people even sell their chametz, and then they'll buy it back. Yeah. The legal minds in Judaism, it's amazing, right? So But then, of course, another preparation for the Passover is Shabbat Hagadol. That's actually next Shabbat. It's the Shabbat that comes before the Passover. And Shabbat Hagadol, it's the great Shabbat. That's what that means. But it's really in anticipation of the coming redemption. And at the Passover Seder, we're actually looking both backwards and forward. We're looking at past redemption from Egypt, from slavery, and we're looking forward to final redemption. The redemption that Yeshua has paid the price for already. And that final redemption, the complete regathering of the Jewish people back to Israel, and our final redemption. Really, our final redemption is when we're with the Lord. You know, we're not we're not struggling with this body of flesh, that David was talking about. But final redemption but that's all been paid for already by Yeshua, our Messiah. Cooking, that's a big one, and mostly for the Passover Seder. There's a lot of things. What are some of the things that we traditionally cook for Passover? A brisket? Did somebody say brisket? Or, yeah. Well, what about matzo ball soup? Did anybody say that? Right, kugels and things like that. I mean, there's a lot of traditional things for Passover, but it involves, obviously, a lot of cooking and preparation there. Dropping down to the final search for chametz. Okay, for a few weeks now we've been cleaning the house, and really the final search for the chametz comes. It comes the day before. Well, actually, usually at the beginning of the 14th of the month, and then the final burning of the chametz, is in the morning, and so. Usually, you've had a few weeks to prepare for this, and there's usually not a lot of chametz left in the house, so it's traditional just to kind of leave a little bit aside and then collect that at the very last moment or the last acceptable moment, and then there's a prayer that goes along with that. Lord, if there's any chametz that's left, may it be nullified, and may it be as if it didn't exist. But it's kind of a prayer, saying, Lord, I did my best. I did my best, and if there's still something there, Lord, please forgive me for that. That has a lot of spiritual meaning too. We are to confess our sins before the Lord, but sometimes we just don't see it all, and that's a process in our spiritual lives. Preparing for the Seder itself, and there's a lot of things that you have to get for that. The zoroah, which is the shank bone, it's the symbol really of the Passover lamb that we can't have. We can't have an actual Passover lamb. Some will eat lamb. In fact, we might do that at the congregational Seder. But the actual Passover lamb was sacrificed in the temple, and then it was brought back to homes in Jerusalem. So the zoroah, that's a reminder, one of the reminders of that Passover lamb. The matzah, of course, the wine, the Seder plate, the bitter herbs, practicing the 4 questions. If you have children in the home, they might require a little practice. And you can tell, that man that was being knighted, he still remembered the Man Nishtana, which is what that's called. And the Haggadot. The Haggadot is that booklet that takes us through the Seder, because Seder means order. And that order, for the most part, was already set in place long before the time of Yeshua. And so what we're actually going to be going through at the Seder this coming Saturday night is something that Yeshua and his disciples would have actually gone through themselves as well. And many people even believe that the afikomen was a tradition that was already in place at that time as well. A lot of preparation. So, this is question number 2. What is the Hebrew word for leaven, and what does it mean? Well, that's a bad question, because it's not what is the Hebrew word, it's what are the Hebrew words, right? Deborah Cook's nodding. She's going, yeah, I knew that. So probably taught that too. So Exodus 12:15 again. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, and the word there is matzot, which is the plural for matzah. So it really doesn't say unleavened bread. Bread would be lechem in the Hebrew. It says matzah. You shall eat matzah for 7 days. That's a positive command, by the way. So you better get some matzah that you actually like, because you can get tired of that matzah pretty quickly. And by the way, most of what I eat is gluten-free. I used to eat the whole wheat matzah, and sometimes, you can get whole wheat matzah that tastes good, and sometimes it tastes like cardboard. You have to be, you just have to try out different brands. Now I'll eat the gluten-free matzah, and that's actually, it's acceptable to eat that during Passover, but it doesn't fulfill this commandment. Do you know why? If you don't, you'll be able to figure it out in a few minutes here as we go through this and as we understand what leaven really is in the Hebrew. Then it says, on the first day you shall remove leaven. It says leaven in the English. It says the same word in the Greek, but it's a different word in the Hebrew, in the original Hebrew, and it's seor. Seor, you're to remove from your homes. Now, what's the difference between chametz, which is leavened grains, and seor? Well, seor is that starter dough. It's the starter dough that, as you make bread, how many of you have made bread from scratch? Did you set aside some of the bread as you're making it and use that for a starter dough the next day or a few days from then? Yeah, so you know the process. You set aside some of it and you let it, and that little starter dough, especially if you let it sit for a few days, it starts to ferment, even just from the natural yeast in the air. And it ferments even more, and it becomes very strong. And then you mix that in with your new dough, the next day or the next day after that, and it creates more leaven, and it helps your bread to rise. And so both of those words are being used in there. The word chametz is it's a grain that is leavened. And I'll come to that in a moment. I say that very specifically. It is a grain that is leavened. It's not actually the leavening agent itself, which is very important when you're trying to determine what you have to get rid of and what you don't have to get rid of. So the seor, again, that's the starter dough. If you don't bake your own bread, you don't have to worry about that. But you get rid of that. And another thing, it says on the first day you shall remove the leaven. And the interesting thing about that is that if you wait until the first day of unleavened bread to remove the seor from your home, you're doing it too late. Even though it looks like that's what it's saying in the Hebrew. It's not really saying that. And we'll come to that in a little bit. That passage, at the bottom there, Devarim 16:3 is Devarim is the Hebrew word for Deuteronomy. And the Hebrew there is lechem oni. And lechem oni it's the only time in the scriptures that matzah is described as lechem, as bread. And lechem oni specifically means the bread of affliction or the bread of poverty. It can mean either one, but it has the same connotation there. The bread of affliction, it's a remembrance, of course, of the slavery that we experienced in Egypt. For us, it says in the Passover Seder, we are to consider ourselves as if we had personally been redeemed from slavery from Egypt, right? So we're to personalize that. But it also has a very personal meaning to us in terms of sin as well. And Paul uses that imagery quite a bit, especially in 1 Corinthians, where he talks about slavery to our own sin. And so, lechem oni, the bread of affliction. We're actually afflicted by our own sin. Do you ever think of it that way? You probably do if you struggle with sin, right? And if you're a believer and you're walking with the Lord, then you have struggled with sin. I mean, that's just part of our walking with the Lord because we tend to do some things that we don't want to do. And so, part of our walk, part of our growth is learning how to walk with the Lord and to have victory in those areas of our life. So for 7 days, we're to eat lechem oni, is what it says there in that passage, the bread of affliction. So going back to 1 Corinthians here, your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little seor, leaven, it leavens, which is mechamatz, or mechametz, which comes from the word chametz. A little seor leavens the whole lump of the dough. That starter dough, it leavens the whole new lump, right? And so we're to start over. That's what Paul is saying. We're to get a clean start. That's what Passover is about. It's about a clean start. It's a clean start with the bread, and it's a clean start for us spiritually is what it's to be. Clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump. And there again, clean out the old leaven. The word there would be seor. Clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened. And by the way, what is Paul saying there in the Hebrew? Just as you are in fact, what would that be in Hebrew? Matzah. Just, okay? In David's reading the Hebrew here in the Brit Hadashah probably, and that's what it would say. You know, that you are matzah. For Messiah, our Passover also has been sacrificed. Therefore, let us celebrate the feast not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. And so Paul is applying this spiritually to our lives. And leaven, you know, leaven has a lot of different meanings within the biblical literature and within the rabbinic literature. Paul is using some of it here, malice and wickedness. You know, we'll get to some other interpretations of that as well. But also it can have a sense of pride and arrogance as well. And so unleavened bread, of course, is flat. You know, leavened bread would be puffed up, right? Puffed up like a person with pride and arrogance. What chametz is not. So this is of interest to all of you who are trying to, you know, clean out the cupboards and trying to figure out what do I actually get rid of and what do I not have to get rid of. Well, first of all, to know what chametz is not. It's not yeast or other leavening agents. Is that a surprise? It's not yeast or other leavening agents such as baking powder or soda. That's not what chametz is, although some of those could be chametz. They're only chametz if they have grain in them. And that's why, by the way, baking powder is usually not acceptable to keep in the home because it usually has grain in it. But baking soda does not. So baking soda you can have in the home because it doesn't have a grain. That's not what chametz means in the Hebrew, in the scriptures. It's a grain that is leavened. It's not the leavening agent itself. Does that make sense? What chametz is. A grain that has been leavened. And these are 5 grains that are mentioned in different parts of the scriptures and in the rabbinic literature: wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and oats. Those are the ones that we usually have to focus on. So, again, we already answered the question, why is baking soda okay while baking powder is not? Baking powder has grain. Baking soda, no grain, so it's not chametz. But then there's this debate within the Ashkenazi community and the Sephardic community. Do we eat kitniot? And you know, this gets into some of the detail. I'll try not to get so detailed in the rest here, but kitniot, because you'll see this so often, you know, kitniot is some of those things that are restricted within the Ashkenazi community, not the Sephardic community in general. It includes rice, corn, cornstarch, soy, and other derivatives of that. And part of the reason for that is because the grain can get easily mixed into those, especially in the past. Now, you know, some of the manufacturing processes are a lot better, and we don't have to worry about that so much. But in times past, it was very easy for grains to get mixed in with that, and so kitniot, just to be sure that we didn't have grains, you know, the Ashkenazi community would not even eat those as well. Now, today, only the Orthodox in the Ashkenazi community are staying away from kitniot. Even the conservative movement and denomination is saying, okay, you know, it's okay to eat kitniot now. Vinegar, you know, that's another one. Sometimes vinegar can have grain in it, but most of it doesn't. And so most of the rabbis say, you know, because generally there's no grain in it, vinegar can be okay. And that's important because vinegar is in so many things, even ketchup things like that. So you can see there's a lot of preparation, and you have to know, you have to understand, what actually goes into these products if you're going to remove all of the chametz in our house. So how can we apply that to our own lives? Is it difficult sometimes to root out and to remove the leaven in our lives? I mean, how many things do we have in our lives that really distract us from the Lord, or even take us away from the Lord, or just cause us to sin, whether it's physically or just in our minds, our hearts? I always like to focus on movies and television shows, even some political things. I can only take so much of that, really. The political commentaries. But there are so many things in our society, really, that take us away from the Lord, and we have to remove those things. We're reminded at Passover to remove those things, but we really have to do some digging sometimes and some soul searching. Is this thing that I'm doing, is it really constructive in my life? Is it really helping me to walk with the Lord, or is it really distracting me and taking me away from the Lord? And that's really the lesson here in our lives, is really examining our hearts, which we'll come back to. But as far as all of the restrictions and such, the easiest way, if you're going to be very strict about this, the easiest way to take care of this is to look for foods that say kosher for Passover. Because it's already been inspected, it's already been taken care of. You don't have to worry about the ingredients. Kosher for Passover, that's the easiest way to go. You can do that for 7 days. And then, of course, are we kosher for Passover? That's the big question, right? I mean, we can get our physical homes kosher for Passover, but how about us? And so 1 Corinthians 11:27, therefore, whoever eats the bread or drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner. It's kind of interesting. A lot of people believe that Paul was instructing them on the Passover holiday. These new believers in Corinth. He's saying, whoever drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner shall be guilty of the body and the blood of the Lord. But let a man examine himself, and so let him eat of the bread and drink of the cup. So again, there's that self-examination. Examine your hearts as you're doing this, because you're remembering what the Lord did for you. You're remembering, the sacrifice that the Lord made for us. Psalm 139:23, search me, O God, and know my heart. Test me and know my anxious thoughts, and see if there be any hurtful way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way. What a beautiful prayer there, and what an important prayer for us. This would be one of those that we memorize, and just pouring out our heart before the Lord. And that's part of the ministry of the Ruach HaKodesh, the Holy Spirit, is to bring to light those things within our lives. And so it's not just us, but we do this through the power of His Spirit as well, and through the fellowship of His Spirit. So back to Exodus 12, and this is question number 3. I said there's 10 questions, but the rest of the questions go pretty quickly, okay? So I promise. It's always laying the groundwork. It takes a little bit longer. So Exodus 12:15, again, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread, which is matzot. On the first day you shall remove leaven, seor, from your houses. For whoever eats chametz from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. And also, you can reference Exodus 34:25, which kind of implies that the leaven has to be removed prior to the Passover sacrifice. So, that has a little bit, that tells us a little bit about when that leaven should be removed, because the Passover sacrifice takes place in the afternoon of the 14th, and the leaven really needs to be removed before that. And so the tradition is, that morning, the absolute last of the chametz is removed from the home. But this is an interesting passage, because what does it actually say there in the English for Exodus 12:15? It says on the first day of unleavened bread, that's the 15th. The Passover sacrifice was on the 14th. And the Passover Seder, by the way, was at the beginning in the evening, at the beginning of the 15th And so if we're saying on the first day you're supposed to remove the leaven, well, it's a little bit late. Except it doesn't exactly say that. But it's so difficult to translate in a way that makes sense that I was looking at the Stone edition. This is an Orthodox edition that tends to be very literal, and it usually gets the point across in its translations. And look what this did. For a 7-day period you shall eat matzot, but on the previous day you shall nullify the leaven from your homes. Well, the text doesn't say that. It doesn't say the previous day. It says Rishon. It says on the first. It does say on the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So what's the answer to this? And the answer, you can see the Hebrew there, Bayom Harishon, in the first day, Tashbitu, Seor Mibatechem, from your homes. Seor, remove, the question is that one in color, Tashbitu. Tashabitu. It comes from the same word that we get Shabbat from. And so it has a sense of ceasing or resting from. And the word there is seor. So, in other words, it's not saying that on the first day you're supposed to finally remove it. It's saying by that time you're ceasing from using any seor, which implies that it was already removed. So that's why the Stone edition here says the previous day. It's making a little commentary there in the translation, which it normally doesn't do, but it's just so difficult to translate. So all that to say, it's a little bit misleading in any of the translations. We are to cease, we're to already be ceasing from using the seor on the first day, but we have already removed it. Does that make sense? That's a very common question, for people who are trying to understand this and trying to follow what the scriptures actually say. So, number 4, do we really celebrate the Passover as some translations suggest? Well, it's interesting because some translations really do say they use the word celebrate, but the word celebrate is never used in conjunction with Passover. At least the literal meaning of Passover and the literal meaning really is referring to the sacrifice itself. You're not celebrating the sacrifice. Just like we don't celebrate the sacrifice of Yeshua. We celebrate what he accomplished. We especially celebrate his resurrection, right? But we don't tend to celebrate, what he actually had to go through for us. So the word there, in this case, v'shachatu hapasach, which is slaughtering the Passover being the lamb. So, and sometimes, in some translations, that's actually, that would be very wrong to try to translate that as celebrate, but some do. Then the Stone translation, in this case, the children of Israel shall make the Pesach offering in its appointed time, which is literally what it says. Usually when it says celebrate Passover, it's usually the word asah, or a form of the word asah, which means to do or to make or to observe is kind of a loose translation of that as well. But it's not to celebrate. So and so it's making really a distinction between the sacrifice of the Passover and then the celebration of the Feast of Unleavened Bread that follows that. So the Passover Seder, we talked about the fact that that's on the first day. So we're already at question 5, right? What is the difference between observing Passover and doing the Passover? How many of you are familiar with Yogi Berra? Not Yogi Bear, but Yogi Berra, the baseball player, the manager, he's very famous, right? Very famous for pithy comments and a lot of things that you really have to think about, and it doesn't really make sense once you've thought about it. But he was famous for saying, you can observe a lot of things just by watching. That sounds like a Yogi Berraism, right? You can observe a lot of things just by watching, yeah. Well, Passover is not, we have the word observing Passover. We don't just observe. I mean, not in the literal sense. We don't just watch what's going on. We participate in it, right? It's an active. We're participating. All of our senses are involved in the Passover Seder, and we're learning, and we're asking questions, right? Right? The Passover Seder is designed for asking questions. So it's about the doing. And again, that word asa means doing. You're doing the Passover. Question number 6. What is the difference between the Karate Kid method of observing Passover and the Jewish interrogatory method? How many of you have heard of those methods at all? I was kind of hoping nobody would raise their hand because I thought I coined them myself, just yesterday actually. So the Karate Kid method, though, I've talked about this. Yeah, Doug's doing the hand motion, wax on, wax off, right? Well, the fact is that we're doing the Passover Seder from a very young age, and even when we become adults, and even well into adulthood, in fact, forever, really, we're always learning something about the Passover Seder. There's always something to learn. And we should always go into the Passover Seder ready to learn something new and to have something, make sense and to click in. Well, if you remember, how many of you saw the original Karate Kid movie? Yeah, enough of you, right? So, yeah, Mr. Miyagi, he's teaching Daniel-san. He's teaching him, he's supposed to be teaching him karate, right? He's supposed to be preparing for a tournament. And all he has him doing is, waxing cars. Do it like this, wax on, wax off, and then, paint the fence and things like that. And what he was doing was he was training him in certain movements that would be beneficial in his karate and in the tournament. But he didn't know that at the time. And so, whenever he would say, why am I doing this? Aren't you going to show me some karate? And all Mr. Miyagi would say is, just keep on doing this, right? And kind of, in some ways we do that with the Passover Seder with children. I mean, children are learning. They don't understand a lot of what they're doing or why they're doing it, but eventually it makes sense. Just like with Daniel-san, finally, Mr. Miyagi, he says, wax off, and he throws a punch, and just automatically Daniel blocks the punch, and he blocks the kicks, and, just by doing those motions that he's done thousands of times over, right? So it's the same thing with the Passover Seder as well. You do it, and you learn as you go. However, I was thinking about this yesterday. There's a little bit more to it than what Mr. Miyagi was doing. Mr. Miyagi was just taking him through the motions. Eventually, I'll tell you why. But the Passover Seder, it's really designed for questions, right? So even the children, at whatever the level they're at, we're supposed to explain the Passover Seder as best as we can at the level that they're at. And so, but we encourage questions. We don't, like Mr. Miyagi, we don't say just, keep your mouth shut and keep on and waxing off. We encourage questions, and we explain as much as the person is ready to understand. And so that is what I would term the Jewish interrogatory method, okay? What is the best time to ask questions at the Seder? The best answer? When is it ever a bad time to ask a question, right? It's designed for questions. Okay, Dr. David Friedman. Dr. David Friedman, he was an academic dean at King of Kings College. Is that right? Do you remember? He's written a number of different books for the Messianic community, and he tells a story in one of his books. He tells a story of when he was a young man, and he's going to yeshiva for the first time. And so at the yeshiva, this first day, they're going to be studying a portion out of the Talmud. And he knows what the portion is, and so he comes in with a lot of, I don't understand a lot of this. But he gets paired with somebody, and there's a lot of discussion that takes place, and, just for hours, really. And so at the end of the period, he loved the process. He loved the discussion. He loved the argumentation that took place at the yeshiva. And the rabbi who was in charge of all this, in charge of the classroom, he comes over to David Friedman. This is before he was a doctor. And he says, so, Friedman, What did you think of the studies today? And he says, oh, Rabbi, this was tremendous. I came in, just having so many questions and not really understanding, what it was that we were going to study today. And by the end, all my questions were answered. It was wonderful, so enlightening. I can't wait for the next time. So Rabbi shakes his head, and he starts to walk away, and then he comes back, and he pounds on the table, questions, questions, questions. How are you ever going to learn without asking a question? Because he didn't ask a question to the rabbi. The rabbi wanted him to keep on asking questions, not to be satisfied that all of his questions were answered. He was there, to answer more questions. He said, do you have any questions for me? He didn't say anything. No, Rabbi, So that's just part of how we learn. It's so important, asking questions at the Seder. Yeshua himself, this is when he was 12 years old, right? He's in Jerusalem. He's staying behind. His parents were already going back to Nazareth, probably in a caravan style. And they realize that he's not with them. Yeshua's back at the temple. And he's with these, it's a pilgrimage feast. These are probably the leading rabbis of the time. And he's in there, and he's asking questions. And they're asking him questions, and he's responding. And it came about after 3 days, his parents, found him in the temple, sitting in the midst of teachers, both listening to them and asking them questions. Our Messiah. Because that's the way you learn. That's the way it's done. And all who heard him were amazed at his understanding and his responses. Question number 8. What is the spiritual application of removing the leaven from the homes? Again, we've gone through this, but look down at verse 8. Therefore, let us celebrate the feast not with the old leaven, nor with the leaven of hatefulness and evil intentions, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. And again, that unleavened bread is symbolic of pride, of arrogance, being puffed up, being full of ourselves. The seor, it's, think about the seor. That's the lump that's used to mix in with the new dough. It's in some ways it's carrying over things from the past. We're to be new. It's to be a new start. We're to be new creatures in the Lord. New life in our Messiah and the Ruach Elohim or the Ruach HaKodesh. Therefore, if anyone is a Messiah, he is a new creation. The old things passed away. Behold, the new has come. That's what Passover is to remind us of. And of course, it's been 2 weeks since you've seen a picture of my granddaughter, right? Just the picture of innocence and new life, a new creation, and, just that, I get to see her almost every day. It's just... I can't wait. She is a major distraction in my life, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. These are recent pictures here. Therefore, if anyone is a Messiah, he is a new creation. The old things passed away. Behold, the new has come. What does Rav Shaul mean by saying you are matzah? Clean out the old leaven seor so that you may be a new lump or dough, since you are matzah. How many of you have ever thought of yourself as matzah? Next time you get a box of matzah, look at that matzah, that pizza matzah, and say, that's me. It's only possible, though, as the Lord does his work in our lives, and as you can see for this. See, look at the next phrase there. It says, for Messiah, our Passover, also has been sacrificed. He's the one that makes that possible. That matzah, it represents sinlessness. It represents purity. And in some ways, it represents God. And by us being characterized as matzah, it means that we're experiencing a new life. We're experiencing, God working in our lives. And remember, we're to become as a newborn child as well. Lechem oni, that bread of affliction. It's also described as bread of affliction. So, when we describe ourselves as matzah, we're also describing ourselves as impoverished and afflicted. What does that mean? It means that because of our own sin, we're coming to the Lord in humility and in repentance. But you know what? That matzah, it reflects God's untarnished image. I have to show another picture. It's, until they get to a certain age, it's like the untarnished image of God. It's just so beautiful and so innocent and so loving. And this is, I don't know if you can see it there. She has, she loves putting my reading glasses in her mouth. And sometimes when she does that, she looks like an intellect, a scholar. Doesn't she? She looks pretty smart for a 10-month-old. So that's her intellectual look. So how does the Passover Seder end? Next year in Jerusalem, right? That's how our prayer started at the beginning, right? With David. Shana Haba'ah Birushalayim Be'eretz Yisrael. Next year in Jerusalem, in the land of Israel. May it be so for us, but really it's talking about may the Messiah be there in Jerusalem. That's our hope. That's our ultimate hope, for him to return, for him to establish peace in Israel and throughout the world, righteousness in Israel and throughout the world. That's what he has already paid the price for, and that's what he's coming back to do. Amen? All right, that'll take us into our closing song. Let's go ahead and stand together.